In the late afternoon of the 6th of August, 1915, Australian soldiers reached an Ottoman trench line on the Gallipoli Peninsula and found it sealed. The defenders had roofed their position with pine logs, heavy, close laid, covered with earth, and the men who arrived on top of it were standing on a ceiling with no door. What they could not yet know, crouching on that timber roof with Ottoman rifles firing through holes cut at their feet, was that the wood beneath them had been cut from the same trees that gave the battlefield its name. The Turks had felled the surrounding pines months earlier to build these defenses, and the solitary tree the Australians had christened Lonesome Pine, the one landmark on a featureless plateau that gave the entire position its name, had already been destroyed before the battle began. Ask yourself this: had you heard of the Battle of Lone Pine before today? Most people have not. And the absence of that knowledge, given what those 5 days actually contained, is not an accident. Stay with this story to the end, because what you are about to discover will not just explain what happened on that plateau in August of 1915. It will explain what it costs to win a battle that you were never supposed to survive. To understand what Lone Pine actually was, you must first understand what 8 months of military failure looks like from the inside. The Gallipoli campaign had begun in February of 1915 with a strategic idea that was not, in its original conception, unreasonable. The Ottoman Empire was Germany's ally, and the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, was the maritime route between the eastern Mediterranean and Russia's Black Sea ports. Control that strait, and the Allied command believed they could threaten Constantinople, supply Russia through a route the German submarine fleet could not reach, and potentially force the Ottoman Empire out of the war entirely. The Anglo-French naval assault that followed failed with the loss of several warships and hundreds of sailors. The decision to replace the naval operation with an infantry landing was made on the logic that boots on the peninsula could accomplish what the fleet could not. On the 25th of April, 1915, British troops went ashore at Cape Helles at the peninsula's southern tip, and the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, landed on the western coast north of Gaba Tepe in an area they would come to call Anzac Cove. The landings were not disasters in the sense of being repelled. They were something worse. They succeeded in putting men ashore and failed in everything they were supposed to accomplish after that. The Ottoman defenders, under commanders who included a 34-year-old lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal, held the high ground. They held it on the first day, and the second, and the third, and the reality of what the campaign had become solidified within a week of the landing. The Anzacs were holding a beachhead roughly 1 kilometer deep and 2 kilometers wide, clinging to a coastline with the sea at their backs and the Ottoman army on every ridge above them. 3.5 months of trench warfare followed. The men who lived that experience left records consistent in their texture. Private James Smith of New South Wales, who landed at Gallipoli on the 13th of July, 1915, and was wounded 4 days after Lone Pine, wrote in his diary in the weeks before the assault, "Have not shaved for 2 weeks. Have not had a wash for a week. I feel dirty, and my clothes are thick with dirt. We are not allowed to go for a swim on account of the enemy shells. After 18 hours in the firing line, we are put on digging trenches. The sun near roasts us. Digging trenches, we often come across the body of a soldier, rotten and decayed, and the smell awful. Sometimes a man's leg or arm. I am absolutely sick of the whole thing. I long for sunny New South Wales and home. That passage was written by a man who had been on the peninsula for 3 weeks. The men of the 1st Brigade had been there since April. The flies were so numerous that soldiers could not eat without their food blackening within seconds. Dysentery, the men called it the Gallipoli Gallop, spread through units with a consistency that made it less a disease than a permanent condition of service. The unburied dead in front of the trenches created a smell that those who survived never found adequate language to describe. Water was chronically short. These were the conditions in which the men of the Australian 1st Division had been living since the landing, and they were the conditions in which they would fight when, in early July of 1915, the Allied command decided that something had to be done. General Sir Ian Hamilton, commanding the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, and Lieutenant General William Birdwood, commanding the Anzac Corps, had arrived at the same conclusion. The campaign could not continue on its present terms. The high ground on the Sari Bair Range, specifically Chinook Bair and Hill 971, overlooking the entire Anzac position, had to be taken. The plan they developed for what became known as the August Offensive was ambitious in the way that plans become ambitious when the situation they are designed to address has no modest solution. 2 columns of men would advance up the Sari Bair Range in the dark, capturing Chinook Bair and Hill 971 during the night of the 6th and 7th of August. British troops would land at Suvla Bay, north of Anzac, seize the commanding heights overlooking the plain, and link up with the Anzac position. A converging attack at dawn from New Zealand and Australian forces on Chinook Bair and the Australian Light Horse at Russell's Top would sweep the remaining Ottoman positions from the ridge. The plan was complex, and it required timing, coordination, and speed in roughly equal measure. The Lone Pine attack was not part of that architecture in any primary sense. It was the bait. Birdwood had determined that a diversionary assault at the southern end of the Anzac perimeter, on the 400 plateau, against the position the men had named after a solitary Turkish pine, would hold Ottoman reserves in place and convince the Ottoman High Command that this was the real objective, while the actual movement happened in the hills to the north. The official word for what Lone Pine was designed to be was demonstration. The men who were going to conduct it understood what they were being asked to do. The Australian 1st Infantry Brigade was chosen for the assault. Approximately 3,000 men, 4 battalions. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th battalions would make the attack. The 1st Battalion would be held in reserve, ready to consolidate the gains. Their selection was not incidental. The 1st Brigade was the first formation the Australian Imperial Force had assembled, the original volunteers of 1914. The men who had signed up before the war had revealed what it actually required of those who offered to fight it. They were chosen because they were the most experienced formation available, and because the ground they were being sent against was the ground their commanding general had no desire to attack at all. Brigadier General Harold Walker had replaced Major General William Bridges as temporary commander of the 1st Division in May of 1915, after Bridges was killed by a sniper while visiting the front lines, a death that was itself a commentary on how close the front lines were to everything at Anzac. Walker was British, a competent officer with a clear-eyed understanding of operational costs, and his position on the Lone Pine attack was unambiguous. He had no desire to assault well-constructed Turkish trenches as a sideshow to concurrent operations at Suvla Bay and Sari Bair. When Hamilton insisted the attack proceed, Walker obeyed. He then devoted himself to giving his men the best possible chance within a situation whose fundamental logic he had already rejected. That combination, understanding the cost of an order and executing it anyway, is not a contradiction. It is the specific moral weight that belongs to a certain kind of military service. Walker's verdict on the battle, once it was over, was a single word: disastrous. Hamilton's from headquarters was a desperate fine feat. Both men were describing the same 5 days. The distance between their assessments was the distance between the man who watched the battalions go in and the man who read the reports of what came back. The officer Hamilton and Birdwood chose to command the 1st Brigade was not Australian, and the choice was deliberate. Colonel Neville Maskelyne Smythe had been sent to Gallipoli specifically by Lord Kitchener to command Australian infantry, and the reasoning behind that decision, that what Australian troops would follow into a position like Lone Pine was not rank but demonstrated personal courage, was a quiet acknowledgement of what the campaign had already taught its commanders about how these men thought. Smith was born on the 14th of August, 1868, in Westminster, London. His father was an eminent geologist. His father's sister, Henrietta Grace Powell, was the mother of Robert Baden-Powell, founder of the Scout movement, a genealogical detail that places Smith precisely in the world of late Victorian imperial service that produced men who treated extraordinary situations as professional occasions. Educated at Westminster School, he graduated from the Royal Military College Sandhurst in 1888, and his pre-war career was unusual by any measure. He had served in India, helped chart the Nile cataracts, put down a modest rising on the Blue Nile, surveyed the Sudan, and was stationed in Egypt when the war began. He was known among those who served with him as the Sphinx. General Sir Cyril Brudenell White explained the nickname with a precision that tells you everything you need to know about Smith. He is so sphinx-like, silent, and imperturbable. He had earned his own Victoria Cross at the Battle of Omdurman on the 2nd of September, 1898. A dervish had run amok among a group of war correspondents. Smith galloped forward, accepted the man's charge, was speared through the arm, and shot him dead. He was 30 years old. Among the officers and men of the 1st Brigade at Gallipoli, that biography appears to have settled, without discussion, the question of whether their British commanding officer understood what was being asked of them. Charles Bean, the official Australian historian of the First World War, recorded the image of Smith at Lone Pine that has survived every subsequent account. Directing reinforcements into the tunnels beneath the 400 plateau, as quietly as a ticket collector passing passengers on to a platform. That is not a compliment to his temperament. It is a description of his operational value. In the middle of the most intense close quarters fighting Australian troops had yet experienced, the man commanding the brigade was processing information and making decisions at a pace that made the catastrophic appear administrative. The men he commanded had spent months on the peninsula, producing the specific competence that emerges not from training, but from surviving conditions that kill people daily. They were not professional soldiers in any European sense. They were volunteers from Australian cities and farms who had been turned, by circumstances they could neither have anticipated nor refused, into the most effective close-quarters infantry on the peninsula. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th battalions had been under fire, in one form or another, for every one of the 104 days since the landing. What those days had deposited in them was not glory. It was the particular, unglamorous expertise of men who had learned, at the cost of watching their companions die, exactly what they could and could not survive. The ground they were being sent to attack had a history that most of the men attacking it did not know. The 400 Plateau was the southernmost significant feature of the Anzac position, a rise that joined Bolton's Ridge to the south with the ridge along the east side of Monash Valley to the north. Its importance was practical rather than dramatic. From its crest, the Ottomans could observe the Australian rear areas as far south as Gaba Tepe, direct artillery onto the approaches to the second ridge, and watch the flow of reinforcements and supplies into the forward positions. The plateau was, in the language of military geography, commanding, not because it commanded anything important in the grand strategic sense, but because it commanded everything that kept the Anzac position functioning. The Australians had named the open ground between the opposing trench lines the Daisy Patch, a name that suggests either irony or the soldier's instinct to render terrible ground familiar through naming. No man's land was between 60 and 100 yards wide, depending on where you stood. The width of the assault front was 160 yards. For the Ottoman engineers, that ground had been a classroom for the better part of a year. They had watched Australian assault methods from close range and drawn the correct conclusions. The roofing of the forward trenches, heavy pine logs 4 inches by 9 inches, laid close together and covered with earth, was not improvisation. It was the product of tactical observation by men who had been defending this specific ground since the landing. The firing holes cut at ankle height into the logs were designed to allow defenders to engage attackers who would be standing on the roof above them. The position had been built by men who understood, from direct experience, exactly what it needed to survive. Behind the Ottoman front line, in a depression called the Cup that was invisible from the Australian positions at the Pimple, the Ottomans had established a regimental headquarters and constructed terraced bivouacs housing large numbers of reserve troops. Despite overflights by British reconnaissance aircraft in June, the Australians were entirely unaware of its existence. No map they had showed it. The Cup was not on any intelligence estimate the planning had relied upon, and what it contained would become apparent only when Australian soldiers pushed through the Ottoman front and ran directly into the men sheltering there. The Ottoman forces defending the position were 2 battalions of the 47th Regiment, under Tevfik Bey, approximately 1,000 men, 500 in the forward trenches, and 500 positioned in depth. A 3-day preliminary artillery bombardment built in intensity over 72 hours to cut the Ottoman wire and degrade the defensive positions. 3 mines had been dug into no man's land and would be detonated to create craters for cover. Forward tunnels projected from the Pimple reduced the exposed distance to be crossed. Each battalion received 4 Vickers machine guns loaded with 3,500 rounds, and a grenade-throwing platoon allocated 1,200 bombs for the entire brigade. Each soldier carried 200 rounds of ammunition, 1 day's rations, and a gas mask. The third wave carried entrenching tools for consolidation. At 2 in the afternoon of the 6th of August, the 3 mines were detonated. At 4:30, the final heavy bombardment commenced, combined Australian, British, and New Zealand artillery, along with naval gunfire from HMS Bacante, directed against Ottoman artillery on Third Ridge. At 5:30, it stopped. The night before the assault, a captain in the 1st Battalion spoke to Lance Corporal Alexander Ross McQueen. "We will make a name for Australia and ourselves tomorrow, Mac." Alfred John Shout was born in Wellington, New Zealand, on the 8th of August, 1882, which meant the 6th of August, 1915, fell 2 days before his 33rd birthday. He was the eldest of 9 children, his father English-born, his mother Irish. His maternal grandfather had served with the Royal Irish Artillery before emigrating. His mother's first husband had served in the Crimea, in Ceylon, and in New Zealand with the 50th Regiment. Shout himself had served as a sergeant in the New Zealand contingent during the Second Boer War, been discharged in 1902, and emigrated to Sydney in 1905. He worked as a carpenter and joiner, joined the militia in 1907, and obtained his commission as a second lieutenant on the 16th of June, 1914, 6 weeks before the war began. He had been wounded 3 times in the first days of the Gallipoli landing. On the 27th of April, with no rest since the beach, he spent the early hours of a fight at Walker's Ridge carrying wounded men from the firing line back to safety, despite being shot himself, refusing evacuation after 1 wound and then a second, responding to every entreaty to leave with the same answer: "I am here with you boys to the finish." He was eventually seized by his own men and carried away still protesting. That earned him the Military Cross. He was promoted to captain on the 29th of July, 1915. 8 days before Lone Pine. He was, by any formal measure, the most decorated soldier of the Australian Imperial Force at Gallipoli to that point. Military Cross, mentioned in dispatches. He carried both into the assault on the 6th of August, along with what McQueen's memory preserved. The quality of a man who, on the night before a battle, he understood clearly, addressed his men with the directness of someone who had already made a decision about what the next day required of him. Private Smith's diary from the preceding weeks captures the sensory reality those men had been living in. The smell of the unburied dead, the flies that blackened food in seconds, the exhaustion of 18-hour shifts followed by trench digging in the midday heat, the 3-day bombardment building since the 4th of August. In the forward saps on the afternoon of the 6th, the men waiting for the 5:30 whistle had been breathing that air for 104 days. They had their 200 rounds. They had their grenades. The Ottoman frontline defenders, sheltering in their tunnels from the final bombardment, were at that moment climbing back to their fire steps. At 5:30 in the afternoon of the 6th of August, 1915, the whistles blew. Half the assault force went through the tunnels. Half went over the top. The evening sun was directly behind the advancing Australians, directly in the eyes of the Ottoman defenders. That tactical advantage had been designed into the timing of the assault. The first wave of casualties was lighter than it might have been, because the defenders had been sheltering from the bombardment, and the time required to climb back to their firing positions was time the first wave of Australians used to cross no man's land. Then they reached the Ottoman line and found the roof. Pine logs, heavy, close laid, earth packed on top, firing holes cut at ankle height, through which Ottoman rifles were now engaging at point-blank range the men standing above them. The position's perimeter was immediately crowded with Australians who had completed their crossing successfully and now had no obvious way to enter what they had reached. 3 responses emerged simultaneously. Some men fired and grenaded downward through any gap they could find, fighting through timber and earth to reach the defenders below. Some worked to lift the logs, each one heavy enough to require 2 men under fire in confined circumstances. Most, following the instinct of men who had learned to read a tactical situation at speed, ran past the roofed section to the uncovered rear communication trenches and entered through the back of the position, working forward through the trench system toward the front. It was not the plan. It was what the situation required, and the men read it correctly. Approximately 70 Ottoman troops who attempted to escape through those same rear trenches ran directly into the Australians entering from behind. They were captured. A small group pushed further through to the Cup, the hidden reserve area the planning had not identified. They were met by Ottoman troops hastily assembling to defend the regimental headquarters. Almost all of those Australians were killed. A handful were taken prisoner. It was the assault's one unqualified disaster, and it happened in the first 20 minutes. By 6 o'clock, 30 minutes after the whistles blew, the main Ottoman position was in Australian hands. What that meant in practice was 7 or 8 isolated posts in the center of the captured ground, connected by hastily dug saps. Men in darkness they did not fully understand, in a trench system they were reading as they moved through it, building sandbag barriers from whatever was immediately available, waiting for the counterattack they knew was coming. At approximately 7 in the evening, it came. The next 3 days are where the story of Lone Pine actually lives, and where most accounts run short. The assault had taken half an hour. The defense took 4 days and consumed 6 battalions. Major Zeki Bey arrived with a group from the 1st Battalion of the 57th Regiment and came through the communication trenches with hand grenades, working through the maze of the former Ottoman position, bay by bay. The mechanics of that fighting are difficult to render in language that does not diminish them. The trenches were narrow. The darkness, once the sun went down, was nearly complete. Grenades thrown in confined spaces sometimes struck the walls and rebounded. Both sides learned that a bomb could travel back and forth 3 times before it exploded, and that the interval between catching it and returning it was not a quantity you could calculate in advance. When the sandbags ran out as barricade material, the Australians used the bodies of the dead. The dead, in those trenches, became infrastructure. Through the night of the 6th and 7th of August, Ottoman reinforcements arrived. The 13th Regiment under Ali Riza Bey marched from the southeast. The 15th Regiment under Ibrahim Sukru committed from the north after 8 in the evening, moving south from its position near Chunuk Bair. And in the dark, simultaneously, something occurred that the men fighting at Lone Pine could not know about and would not understand for years afterward. The 9th Division, under the German Colonel Hans Kannengießer, had received orders to move toward Lone Pine to reinforce the Ottoman defense. It began moving. Then its orders changed. The Australian assault had been so unmistakably successful in overrunning the Ottoman front that the Ottoman High Command concluded the position required substantial reinforcement. Kannengießer's division was redirected north. When it arrived in the area of Chunuk Bair, it found 1 Ottoman artillery battery and approximately 20 infantrymen. The New Zealand attack on the summit, the hinge on which the entire August offensive turned, had not yet secured its objective. There was at that moment a realistic prospect that it would. Kannengießer's force arrived in time to seriously delay it. The reinforcements drawn by Lone Pine's success had been reassigned to Chunuk Bair once the Ottoman command recognized, correctly, that the real threat was north. The diversion had worked. The forces it attracted had kept moving to the place that mattered most. On the 7th of August, the fighting at Lone Pine ceased to be a tactical operation and became a grenade war. Both sides were working through the same maze of captured and recaptured trench bays, pushing the boundary back and forth by meters, holding what could be held and losing what could not. 50 Australian soldiers worked through the 7th of August at Anzac Cove, manufacturing improvised bombs from empty jam tins, producing over 1,000 grenades that were sent up to the brigade that afternoon. The supply of standard-issue Mills bombs had been allocated with the assumption that the fighting would last hours, not days. It was during that grenade war that Leonard Maurice Keysore began the 50 hours that earned him the Victoria Cross, and that he subsequently described, with a precision that resists further embellishment, as the only adventure he ever had. Keysore was born on the 3rd of November, 1885, in Maida Vale, London. His father, Benjamin Keysore, was a Jewish clock importer of German descent. He had been educated at Townley Castle in Ramsgate, spent 10 years in Canada, and emigrated to Sydney approximately 3 months before the outbreak of the war. Arriving in the country he had chosen for roughly 12 weeks when he enlisted in the 1st Battalion on the 18th of August, 1914. An English-born Jewish man of German descent, enlisting in an army he had barely arrived at the edge of. He had decided something when he enlisted, and the decision held for the duration. His function at Lone Pine was not rifle work and not bayonet work. As Turkish bombs, the spherical cricket ball grenades filled with 100 grams of TNT lobbed into his section of trench, Keysore moved forward and either smothered them with his coat or a sandbag when there was no time to throw them back, or caught or retrieved them and returned them. He caught several in flight and pitched them back. He was wounded twice on the 7th of August and told to go for treatment. He refused. He volunteered to throw bombs for another company whose bomb throwers had all been killed or wounded, and maintained this for 50 consecutive hours. Private James Talon was in the same trench. Keysore was a great bomb thrower, and he and McShane and myself had a hot time of it. We were on the job almost continually for 3 days, until we were fairly dropping with the strain of it, and our arms ached like anything. McShane had a bomb in his hand and brought it to me to light the fuse, and just as I lit it, the bomb exploded prematurely, killing poor old Mac. McShane died in the trench beside Keysore. Keysore kept throwing. Charles Bean's description of what Keysore accomplished is clinical and therefore devastating. Twice wounded, he saved his trench and removed the enemy from a temporarily commanding position. Behind that clinical language is a man standing in a narrow hole in the ground for 50 hours, picking up live grenades and throwing them back at the people who threw them, while a friend died beside him. By the morning of the 8th of August, the trenches at Lone Pine had become something that the language of military operations was not designed to describe. Captain Harold Jacobs of the 1st Battalion. The trench is so full of our dead that the only respect that we could show them was not to tread on their faces. The floor of the trench was just one carpet of them. This in addition to the ones we piled into Turkish dugouts. Private Victor Laidlaw of the 2nd Field Ambulance, writing after visiting the position on the 10th of August. In the Lonesome Pine Trench, which we captured, the Turks were lying there 5 feet deep, and our fellows had to fight standing on the top of them. Both men had been trained to record what they observed without elaboration. Neither elaborated. Throughout the night of the 7th and 8th, the 47th Regiment launched its most determined effort. Tevfik Bey, the regimental commander held responsible for the loss of Lone Pine, led it himself. The counterattack failed to retake the front trench line, but succeeded in pushing the Australians back from some forward positions. Tevfik Bey was killed in the effort he led to recover what he had lost. On the 8th of August, the 1st and 2nd Battalions, their casualties so severe they could no longer maintain an effective line, were withdrawn from the position. The 7th Battalion moved into their places. The 9th of August arrived with the captured Ottoman position still in Australian hands, and the Ottoman command still committed to recovering it. 3 regiments had been thrown at ground that the original defending force of 2 battalions had held with 1,000 men. The Australians had rotated through the equivalent of 6 battalions. The position itself, 150 meters of former Ottoman trench across a 300-meter front, had become the argument that neither side was prepared to concede. On the morning of the 9th, the 1st Battalion had been brought back after a brief relief. The section known as Sas's Sap, a particularly contested stretch of the trench system, had been partially cleared by Captain Cecil Sasa of the 4th Battalion, but subsequently reoccupied by Ottoman troops. Shout took a small party and went in. He charged down the occupied trench. He threw 4 bombs among the defenders. 8 men died. The remainder fled. From the position gained in the morning, he captured a further section of trench in the afternoon, continuing to bomb at close range under heavy fire. He primed 3 grenades. The 3rd exploded before he could throw it. It severed his right hand. It destroyed his left eye. He was evacuated from the trench. The accounts say he remained cheerful. On the hospital ship HMHS Neuralia on the 11th of August, 1915, 3 days after his 33rd birthday, he died. He was buried at sea. He had no grave that could be found. His wife Rose received his Victoria Cross by post in June of 1916. The citizens of Darlington and Sydney took up a collection to provide Rose and their daughter Florence with a house. He had told McQueen on the night before the assault, "We will make a name for Australia and ourselves tomorrow, Mac." He had been right by several days, at a cost he had also clearly understood. Also, on the 9th of August, Ottoman troops achieved a break-in at the junction between 2 Australian battalions and pushed through to the 1st Brigade's forward headquarters. Smith joined the defense personally. The Sphinx, who had been directing reinforcements into tunnels with the detached precision of a ticket collector, was now fighting alongside the men he had been directing. The breakthrough was driven back. The position held. Late in the afternoon of the 9th of August, the Ottoman commanders called off further attempts. 3 regiments had been committed. The commanding officers of both the 47th and 15th regiments were among the dead. Ottoman casualties across the battle numbered between 5,000 and 7,164, with the Turkish academic Kenan Kelik of Çanakkale Onsekiz Mart University placing the figure at the higher end, broken down as 1,520 killed, 4,700 wounded, 760 missing, and 134 captured. Against those losses, 2,277 Australians had been killed or wounded from the 4,600 men committed across the battle's duration. Almost exactly half. Then came the question of what, exactly, had been accomplished. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions at Lone Pine, the most ever given to an Australian division in a single engagement. All 7 are now held at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Their distribution across the battalions that fought there tells a story the decorations themselves do not. Charles Bean recorded it plainly. The battalions of the 1st Brigade lost so heavily that few witnesses of their efforts remained. Consequently, 4 of the 7 Victoria Crosses went to the 7th Battalion, the reinforcing unit that had arrived on the 2nd day, that had fought with equal courage, but that had been in the position long enough for sufficient men to survive and formally attest to what they had witnessed. The 1st Brigade, the battalions that made the assault on the evening of the 6th, that held through the night against Zeki Bey's first counterattack, that built the sandbag barriers and blocked the communication trenches with the bodies of their own dead, had been so annihilated that the mechanism of formal recognition could not function. The Victoria Cross citation process required living witnesses to attest to specific actions in formal statements. The 1st Brigade had run out of witnesses. Those deeds were not unrecognized because they were unworthy of recognition. They were distributed differently because the men who could have signed the citations were dead. This is not a conspiracy. It is the mechanics of how a system designed for administrative purposes interacts with a battle that consumed its own record keepers. Bean understood it. The observation he made about witnesses is not an accusation. It is a description of what extreme casualties actually mean beyond the numbers. They erase the institutional memory of what produced them. Shout's Victoria Cross was the only one awarded at Gallipoli not held by the Australian War Memorial for the better part of a century. In 2006, his grandson sold it to relieve some of the family's financial difficulties, and the memorial acquired it. All 7 Lone Pine Victoria Crosses were displayed together in the Hall of Valor for the first time. Keesore returned to England after the war. He went into the family clock business. He described himself in later interviews as a common or garden clock importer for whom the war had been the only adventure he ever had. A self-assessment that the 50 hours at Lone Pine does not contradict so much as place in a specific kind of perspective. He was a shy man who found the public's interest in his actions difficult to accommodate. In 1927, he agreed to reenact his bomb throwing for a silent film called For Valor. The director, apparently dissatisfied with the visual impact of the dummy grenades, secretly wired real explosive charges into the set without informing Keesore. One detonated at close range. His jaw was fractured, 8 teeth removed, his arm and leg peppered with shot. He sued and was awarded £675 in damages. He died of cancer in London on the 12th of October, 1951. William Dunstan, blinded in the fighting on the 9th of August, for which he received the Victoria Cross, recovered his sight sufficiently to build a subsequent career. He became the general manager of the Herald newspaper in Melbourne. That Lone Pine's tactical success was genuine is not in question. The main Ottoman position was captured and held. Ottoman reserves were drawn to the battle. The assault was conducted with operational competence, and the defense held under sustained counterattack by men who had been on the peninsula for over 3 months in conditions that had systematically degraded their physical resources while building their operational ones. Hamilton was not wrong when he described it as a desperate fine feat. What requires examination is what the battle accomplished inside the larger operation it was designed to support. Canongeser's 9th Division, redirected north on the night of the 6th and 7th of August, arrived at Chunuk Bair to find it lightly held. The New Zealand attack on the summit had not consolidated. The timing of Canongeser's arrival and the delay it imposed on the New Zealand assault determined, in ways that subsequent analysis has consistently confirmed, whether Chunuk Bair would be secured in time to matter. It was not secured in time. The Ottoman reserves that Lone Pine had drawn were already there. Stated without the hedges that make it sound less damaging than it is, the reinforcements attracted by Lone Pine's success ended up at Chunuk Bair anyway, having been reassigned once the Ottoman command recognized where the real threat lay. The diversion worked as designed. The forces it attracted kept moving to the most critical point. This is what historians mean when they describe the Lone Pine attack as having been too successful as a diversion. On the 7th of August, the day the grenade war was at its most intense, the charge at the neck took place. 4 waves of Australian light horsemen, ordered to rush a narrow strip of ground at Russell's Top. The plan had required New Zealand forces to already be on Chinook Bear, attacking from behind the Ottoman position. They were not there. The waves went forward regardless. From 600 men, almost 400 became casualties. The ground gained was nothing. The two Australian actions of the August offensive that the historical memory holds closest, Lone Pine and the Neck, happened one day apart, inside the same failing plan. One took the ground it was sent for, the other did not. Both produced the same strategic result. At Suvla Bay, the British Ninth Corps had landed fresh divisions against opposition, so light it barely registered, then failed to advance to the high ground with the urgency the operational plan required. Lieutenant General Frederick Stopford, who had never commanded troops in combat before being given this assignment, was visited by Hamilton on the 8th of August, who found Stopford's men still near the beach, apparently waiting for orders that would clarify what they were supposed to do with the unoccupied heights 2 miles away. By the time those heights were seriously contested, Ottoman reinforcements had arrived. The opportunity had closed. Walker had called the result disastrous. He was describing something larger than Lone Pine in isolation. What he was naming was the entire architecture of the August offensive, a plan requiring synchronized movements at night across difficult terrain, with communications inadequate to the coordination required, executed by a force that included an inexperienced landing corps under a general who had never led troops in battle. Lone Pine was the one component of that architecture that functioned as designed. The problem was the structure around it. The Lone Pine Cemetery was established in the ground the Australians had called the Daisy Patch, the open space between the former trench lines, too exposed to cross during the battle, covered in the dead of both sides for 4 days while the living fought over it. It holds 1,167 graves. 504 of those graves are unidentified. The Lone Pine Memorial, standing within the cemetery, commemorates 4,934 Australian and New Zealand soldiers who died in the Anzac sector and have no known grave, men like Shout, buried at sea with no marker, and the soldiers whose remains could not be recovered or identified from what was recovered. It is the main Australian memorial on the Gallipoli Peninsula. It is the site of the Anzac Day dawn service. Not Cape Helles, where the British went ashore on the 25th of April. Not Chinook Bear, where the New Zealanders briefly held the summit before the Ottoman counterattack swept them back. Not the Neck, where 400 men died in a charge that lasted minutes. Lone Pine, the demonstration, the diversion, the battle walker called disastrous, is where the dawn service is held. Thomas Keith McDowell was a private in the 23rd Battalion, which took up the Lone Pine position after the 1st Division was relieved in September of 1915. During the evacuation in December, the rearguard action that 33 men of the 24th Battalion mounted to maintain the pretense that the trenches were still occupied while the main force withdrew to the beach. McDowell picked up a pine cone from the branches that had been used to roof the Ottoman position, branches cut from the tree the battle was named for, and placed it in his haversack. He gave it to his wife's aunt, Emma Gray of Grasmere near Warrnambool in Victoria, on his return to Australia. 12 years later, she planted the seeds. 5 germinated. 4 survived. One was planted at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne on the 11th of June, 1933. One at Warrnambool Botanic Gardens. 2 others in Victoria at Wattle Park and at the Soldiers' Memorial Hall near Terang. A second soldier, Lance Corporal Benjamin Smith of the 3rd Battalion, had also retrieved a cone from the branches at Lone Pine and sent it to his mother in Inverell, New South Wales. His brother had been killed in the same battle. That cone sat in a drawer for 13 years before his mother planted the seeds. 2 seedlings grew. One was planted in Inverell. The other was planted at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra in 1934 by Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. Seeds from that Canberra tree were used to grow the pine now standing in the Lone Pine Cemetery itself. The tree in the cemetery grew from seeds from a tree in Canberra, which grew from a cone retrieved from branches that roofed the Ottoman trenches, which were cut from the pines that gave the battle its name, which were felled to build the position the Australians were sent to take. The memorial stands on ground where the dead cannot all be named. The tree above it grew from the thing that was destroyed to make the battle possible. 5 days. 2,277 Australians killed or wounded. Against a defending force eventually committed at 3 regiments, with losses of between 5,000 and 7,000, for 150 meters of former Ottoman trench across a 300-meter front. The ground they held until the 20th of December, 1915, when the last Australian troops were evacuated from Gallipoli and the 400 plateau returned to Ottoman control, as if the 5 days of August had not occurred, as if the position had never been anything other than what it was before the whistles blew. What remains is the cemetery, and the names on the wall above it, and the trees growing in Melbourne and Warrnambool and Canberra and Inverell, and in the cemetery itself, grown from seeds that sat in drawers for over a decade before anyone thought to plant them. The battalions of the 1st Brigade lost so heavily that few witnesses remained. That is Bean's sentence about the Victoria Cross distribution, and it is also, more broadly, the record of what Lone Pine was. The generation that signed up in 1914, before the war had declared what it would require of those who volunteered for it, had been in those trenches for 104 days before the assault. They were the witnesses to their own campaign, and the campaign consumed them. The Lone Pine Memorial is named for a tree that does not exist. The trees grown from its seeds are standing now over the graves of men whose names could not always be determined, and the wall of men who have no graves at all. When the dawn service is held each April, the people who attend stand under trees that grew from cones carried home in haversacks by soldiers, some of whom lost brothers in the battle they are remembering. That is the right place to stand. Now, tell me in the comments whether you had heard of the Battle of Lone Pine before today, because the men in that cemetery and the nearly 5,000 whose names are on the wall above them with no grave beneath deserve at minimum that someone is still paying attention.